Yes.
Yes, I have a question about extra-biblical evidence for the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, if you have any.
Any references that we have to Jesus' resurrection appearances that are not in the New Testament documents tend by their very nature to be later and derivative, and therefore less valuable. These are sources that already know the Gospels, you see, and so they're not independent. And as I explained last night, what you're looking for is early independent sources of confirmation. And these references outside the documents of the New Testament are derivative and later, and therefore they're not really important or valuable for the historian. Now, interestingly enough, there is, in a sense, extra-biblical evidence for these appearances, but it's not in the sources later than the New Testament. It's in the sources earlier than the New Testament that the New Testament writers used in writing their documents. So last night I explained that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is not writing in his own hand. He is quoting from an old formula that probably goes back to within the first 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. So this is an extra Pauline source. You can't say, well, this material comes from Paul in AD 55 when he wrote to the Corinthians. No. This is a quotation of an extra New Testamental source that goes back to within the first 5 years after the crucifixion. Similarly, I showed that in writing the story of Jesus' passion, Mark was not writing freehand. He was using this early pre-Markan passion source that probably also goes back to within the first decade after Jesus' crucifixion. So one of the most important new developments in New Testament scholarship is the identification of these sources that the New Testament writers themselves used. And so that's where the really important, quote-unquote, extra-biblical material is to be found, not in these later derivative secondary sources that know the Gospels, but rather in the pre-New Testament sources used by Matthew and Luke and Paul and Mark. And when you get to those early sources, and especially if they're independent, you see, then you've hit historical pay dirt.